From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Can conservatives really change the course of government in a modern democracy? Donald Trump is going to try with the help of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and their Department of Government Efficiency, but they'll face enormous obstacles in the permanent bureaucracy, the press corps, and of course, Washington interest groups. An example of what they'll contend with is the story of Liz Truss, the prime minister for 44 days, all of 44 days in the United Kingdom. Her story is the subject of a new documentary by WSJ Opinion called The Prime Minister versus the Blob, and that's our subject for today on Potomac Watch. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot, the editor of the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and I'm here with Michael Pack, the producer of the documentary and our collaborator on Opinion Docs, plus Joe Sternberg, our columnist based in London, who informed the story and is featured as a commentator in the documentary. Welcome, Michael and Joe. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having us on, Paul.
Michael, this is our second Opinion documentary. The first, released earlier this fall, was on the Crown Heights riots in New York City. This is our second one. Tell our audience, why tell the story of Liz Truss?
I think it's particularly relevant now. I mean, it's called The Prime Minister versus the Blob because she feels she was defeated, at least in part, by the British version of the administrative state or the swamp, which they call the Blob, which is a way better term, and it's catching on a little bit over here. This film tells the story of her 44 days in office. We have a long interview with Liz Truss, but we have many of her critics, both inside the Tory party and in Labour and in her cabinet. So it's a complicated story. I relied on Joe Sternberg, to guide me through the complications of it all. And I say that this story, in addition to having lessons for Donald Trump in dealing with our version of the Blob, we say they're going to try to do to him what they did to Liz Truss. I think it's also a great story. I say it combines a little bit of Yes Minister and a little bit of House of Cards. So it's a great political story.
Nobody was shot, though, along the way that I remember, although politically speaking, certainly Liz Truss was, among some others. From my point of view, it's also a story of modern conservative politics, especially in Europe, where the right can be as much averse to change as the left and to go along with big government and favor the status quo. But let's maybe define the term blob, and let's listen to Liz Truss, how she defines it.
I think the blob describes wider than just the government. It's a groupthink shared by senior media executives, senior corporate executives, civil servants. Wouldn't it be better if experts and technocrats were running everything? That's a whole shared belief system. Big spending, big government, big taxes, big immigration.
Well, Joe, the conventional wisdom about Truss is that she tried radical tax cutting. It blew up the bond market and collapsed the British pound, and then failed inevitably because the policies were mistaken. The real story is a lot more complex, and it's told in this documentary. Why don't you give us an insight into why you think it's more complicated?
Well, I mean, you basically ran into the confluence of a bunch of different forces. I mean, what part of the problem here was just basic economic. The British economy had been struggling for a long time. It had been underperforming. Some good years after the 2008 global financial panic had masked some fundamental weaknesses, especially very weak productivity and wage growth. And so, voters were already intuiting that there was a deep problem with the economy that helped explain the Brexit referendum in 2016. So that's one factor that's going on. Politically, you had a problem that, as you pointed out a minute ago, Paul, you had the main center-right party, the Conservatives or the Tories, had lost their way on a lot of these economic issues. They had lost the muscle memory that they had had from the 1980s and the Thatcher era for how to talk about economic growth, how to develop the economy. And then you had some of these special issues that no one necessarily saw coming at the beginning. For example, financial fragilities that develop over a long period when you have had a very weak economy and a bunch of other economic policies that are creating more distortions than they are economic growth. And so you kind of ended up with this confluence of forces where all of a sudden you have this politician trying to come in as if from outside of this very closed ecosystem with a completely different set of ideas, which are not at all crazy because this was the kind of policy prescription that had worked in the UK and the US in the 1980s, but it was not really something the system was ready for. And partly what you saw in this market reaction that gets so much attention and focus now was how that agenda stumbled into some of these pre-existing financial fragilities. And I think that that is potentially a lesson that reformers need to be mindful of moving forward, that you have to be aware that things might break and you have to be ready for that possibility. But then also the difficulty that she ran into overcoming some of this entrenched political opposition and the fact that so many parts of the system, her own party and also the media, have just forgotten how to think about economic growth and how to talk about economic policy debates.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Joe, particularly that last one, the groupthink that Truss identified, particularly in the economics reporting and commentary in the UK, as in most of Europe, is entirely Keynesian. It basically suggests that big spending is going to drive growth, that the regulatory state can manipulate various policies to maintain growth and to raise incomes. And that has not been terribly successful in Europe. And Truss was trying something else. We're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about who specifically in the Blob undermined Liz Truss when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here on our Potomac Watch podcast. I'm here with Michael Pack and Joe Sternberg. So, Michael, as an American who was looking at the Truss 44 days in that episode, what struck you as most interesting as you looked at the arc of that story?
Well, I looked at it both as an American, as somebody who was fairly recently in the first Trump administration and had to deal with the American version of the Blob. So I had a lot of personal sympathy for Liz Truss. She did make many mistakes, and a lot of her cabinet members and other Tories pointed them all out in the film. But I'm pretty sympathetic to the difficulty of making these choices under this kind of pressure. Pressure from, as you just said, Paul, just on the economic front, everybody in Treasury are having an opposite economic view, a Keynesian view, thinking the tax cuts are simply crazy. And no support in the media, no support from staff. I mean, to be in this sort of pressure cooker, that's why mistakes are made. And that's why I think it is a warning for people who are going into the Trump administration confident that they're going to have an easy time reforming.
Right. That's for sure. Some of the blob that Liz Truss refers to is the media conformity, the Financial Times, the London Times, even some of our sister News Corp publications. They have subscribed to the Keynesian point of view about economics, but also, Joe, the bureaucracy, the financial bureaucracy in the UK, and particularly Andrew Bailey at the central bank. Tell us about his role.
Yeah, I mean, what emerged in the Truss saga is that the Bank of England became probably the blobbiest part of the blob in this story, because Liz Truss had accidentally wandered into the buzzsaw of some of these financial fragilities. And the particular thing that she ended up struggling with was something called liability-driven investments, or LDI. Look, the details are obscure, so you can understand why people don't pay attention to it. But the basic point of it is that you had all of these defined benefit pension plans who had to come up with some way of adapting to this long period of very low economic growth and very low interest rates. And they'd done it with this hedging strategy that would work fine in that environment and would start to run into trouble very quickly if interest rates went up, which is what was happening in 2022, partly because of inflation,
right,
and partly because some of the market wobbles resulting from Liz Truss's fiscal plan. So you have this sort of financial fragility set up, and you might think, well, why didn't the Bank of England see that this was a risk, since this was their job to do that kind of financial regulation and to maintain financial stability? And I suspect that people within the Bank of England were afraid the public would start asking that very question. And so I think quickly they fell into this pattern where they would put out all of these statements suggesting that actually maybe the market panic was a little bit justified because that fiscal plan was so crazy. And then they would come up with these interventions like a big program to buy government bonds to stabilize the market. But it would come with a set deadline, which ended up becoming a political cliff edge because that created a lot of pressure for Truss to try to reverse her agenda. And, I think that this is an example really in the story of how you end up with this institution that has formal independence from any of the parts of the government, like the Treasury, that are politically accountable. And you can say that there might be good reasons for that kind of independence, but the consequence is that you have one set of technocrats led by the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey, who end up making these enormously consequential decisions in the heat of a crisis that then place big demands on the Democratic politicians who are accountable to voters. And the strange thing is that people here are so incurious about this. I mean, the question isn't why are we doing this documentary now? The question is why have so few people in the British financial press been interested in this kind of stuff? I mean, it's both very interesting and politically important.
Well, the reason is, I think, and you know the answer to this, is the conformity of the British press. They all subscribe to the same storyline. So why should we re-examine that storyline? That might contradict what it is we were preaching at the time. Michael, you mentioned earlier that Liz Truss made some mistakes. What were they, in your view, one or two?
So we try in these kinds of documentaries, as you know, Paul, to tell the story objectively from all points of view. And I try not to express my opinions. We try to be straightforward, factual reporting, as you and I have agreed to. So we let other people tell what they think her mistakes are in this film. And her critics are inside her administration. Jacob Rees-Mogg, for instance, felt her very first U-turn was a mistake, a sign of weakness, on cutting the highest tax rate from 45% down.
It was, 45 to 40? And then
yes.
He caved on that in short order.
Yes. So the idea is it signaled weakness. Maybe it did. And in the end, she fired her Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, and reversed all of her Thatcherite mini-budget plans. So could she have not done that? Could she have sustained it? Some people in the documentary say she should have toughed it out. It's hard for me to say. I would defer to Joe on that one. It's tough to make these calls. She felt that the whole British economy was at risk of collapsing. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Surely the people around her, this Keynesian orthodoxy that you refer to, Paul, made her think that that was the case. So I'm not sure. But surely those are good questions to ask, and the documentary poses them. I think, to go back to Joe's point, I think one of the unique things about the documentary, not just the news coverage, but all the documentaries about Liz Truss, including those made in the UK by the BBC, don't even bother to mention the LDI crisis or these financial weaknesses, even to dismiss them out of hand. It's as if they didn't exist.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary illustration of conformity and groupthink. Let's listen to Liz Truss explain why she ultimately resigned.
I never wanted to be Prime Minister and sit in the chair and go to the meetings. I wanted to be Prime Minister to change things, and it was clear that there was not the will in the Conservative Parliamentary Party to do that, and therefore that is why I resigned.
Joe, she was not the first Tory prime minister in their 13-year-long rule. She succeeded Boris Johnson, who succeeded Theresa May, who succeeded David Cameron. And in that sense, the Tories were probably stretching the patience of the British public just in the normal ways that a long-serving government does in a democracy. But it seems to me that one of her mistakes was not preparing her own party for the sharp shift in strategy, economic strategy that she would ultimately propose. So some of them, particularly some of the old stodgy Keynesians, conservative in the worst possible way of just not wanting to do much at all, that they weren't prepared for heavy weather when the bond markets showed some turmoil.
Yes, I mean, part of her political problem is that, there are almost two conservative parties. So there's the Conservative Party out in the countryside, which is the actual conservative voters, 100,000 plus of those who were the ones who had ultimately supported her very strongly to become the party leader and the prime minister. But then you also have the parliamentary party, the Tory members of parliament, and that group of people had never wanted her. She was always their second choice in the election race that brought her to power in mid-2022. And so I think that she was always going to face this political dilemma where, although her agenda was actually quite popular with the grassroots of the party, and I think that you can make an argument that a lot of British voters are very persuadable on these issues, even though they are not accustomed to hearing this. So I think that she might have had some success if she had taken the time to communicate this message more to the broader electorate, but she still was going to face that problem that a lot of the members of parliament who she was going to require to actually cast votes in favor of any of this budget legislation were very resistant. And I think that there's a lesson for Republicans here, because it shows and it warns that parties of the right can lose this muscle memory. So we have this experience from the 1980s in the US and the UK of a free market supply side agenda under Reagan and Thatcher being very successful. And that was good for the countries, and it was also good for the parties. And yet you can forget over time what those ideas are, why they work, and what is the trick for explaining that to the voters so that your party and the electorate will come along with you. And I think that she underestimated the extent to which the Tories had forgotten that.
We're going to take another break, and when we come back, we'll talk about whether or not any modern democracy is reformable when we come back.
Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here with Michael Pack, a producer of opinion documentaries, and Joe Sternberg. Of course, history didn't stop when Liz Truss resigned. There was a successive prime minister, Rishi Sunak, a Tory prime minister. He appointed a new chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, who proceeded to not only reverse Truss's policies, but essentially to raise taxes and appease the Blob, if you will. But that was not a very successful effort either, because what happened is that interest rates remained high for some of the reasons Joe mentioned. This was an inflationary environment. They were going to be high. And when Sunak called the election, he and his party were routed in a historic defeat. So now we have a Labour government, which is in power, Keir Starmer, the prime minister, and they'll get their chance to govern. Of course, they came right out of the blocks and raised taxes. No big surprise, raised spending. Not very popular either. Michael, you mentioned the analogy to the attempts to change in UK policies and Liz Truss's experience to what the Trump folks are doing. And I think they're somewhat analogous as well. You mentioned that. What should Trump reformers be looking for?
Well, I think they need to have a little more caution going into it. I mean, it's nice to hear all this overconfidence, but I think they have to be aware that there are things out there like the LDI crisis waiting for them, hidden icebergs. And there are people like Andrew Bailey, who probably Liz Truss didn't identify as their primary, kind of opponent. So there are really hidden problems there. They would be well to try to figure them out ahead of time. And I think it's a challenging thing. And it does take a lot of political courage to deal with it. And it'll be interesting to see it play it out. But I think they should all watch the film and try to apply the lessons to the department that they're going to head, which are all vastly complex problems with many hidden dangers in them.
Yeah, I have seen it. Different versions of this story going back to the 1980s with Reagan, of course, who wanted to shake up the government. And Reagan once described the Iron Triangle in Washington. And you have the Congress, congressional representatives who have their own policies they favor. Then you have the interest groups outside who benefit from those policies. Then you have the bureaucracy whose power depends on those policies. They all work together to avoid change. If they want any change at all, it's more power to the bureaucracy, more power to the congressional committees and the chairs, and more power to the interest groups who benefit from them. And it raises a question, Joe, that to my mind, this documentary, I think, so very well asks and raises implicitly, which is, can you change anything in these modern welfare state democracies? Is it that they just get so barnacled up by these interest groups and the power of the administrative state that even when you get a mandate from the voters, you really can't change them?
Well, you can look at that way, or you can look at it in a different way, which might be more optimistic or pessimistic, depending, which is...
I can't wait to hear how you balance those 2 points.
Well, clearly the model that we have now is broken. I mean, that's sort of the other thing that the Blob doesn't want to talk about after the Truss episode, as you pointed out, Paul. I mean, the alternative has not been a notable success. And in fact, we're now looking at an extended period of stagnation here because the high spend, high tax alternative to the Truss agenda is essentially economic stagnation, and then it becomes impossible to pay the bills no matter how high you try to raise the taxes. So the old system is going to fail eventually. And I think the question is then, how do those of us who believe that free markets are the solution and big government is not, how do we position ourselves to explain that failure of the old model and present a better alternative to voters? And I think that part of the problem that Truss ran into, which has really stuck out at me as I've rewatched our film and reread some of our coverage at the time, is I think that there was a storytelling problem that she had here. So we've talked about the tax cut agenda. The other thing that shows up in the film that was an important part of this was the energy subsidies that she did that actually were more expensive than the tax cuts.
Right.
But I mean, if you had talked to them at the time, if you picked up the phone and spoke to any of her inner circle of advisors, they probably would have told you this is only a down payment on a much bigger agenda, that our vision includes unsticking the economy so that we deal with the regulatory problems, we make it easier for people to start businesses. We are going to deal with the government spending because that also needs to be part of the solution. And so there was a comprehensive vision there, but she never really got a chance to communicate that to the public. In fact, you can argue her mistake was not waiting to do some of these specific policies until she had started communicating what the bigger vision was. So I think that part of the failure here and part of the lesson that American Republicans can learn is that, history has shown you can bring voters along, but they want to know what the destination is. And they want to know that you have a roadmap that is going to get you all the way there. And so I think that her mistake was rushing piecemeal into important parts of this, but not explaining how these were going to fit into a bigger agenda and how that vision would work.
That, of course, reinforces Michael's point that you have to be careful and have a plan and a clear sense of what you want to do and how to do it. The documentary, The Prime Minister versus the Blob on WSJ Opinion, Michael Pack, producer, is an important story, compellingly told, I think, and is very much worth downloading and watching, as is the earlier documentary on the Crown Heights riots. Michael, we're doing more of these collaborations. What's next on your agenda?
Well, I always like to tell viewers and listeners that it's free, since not everything on the Wall Street Journal site is free, and this one is.
That's right. So
this one, we came up with a very easy to remember a URL. It's wsj.com/Liz-Truss, TRUSS. So that was a great innovation.
You can see that on YouTube as well as on the WSJ Opinion YouTube site.
Yes. As you know, I think this is very important collaboration. We've gotten many people think it's visionary of the Wall Street Journal opinion section to make this move into video. Others seem to be envious, which is always a good sign. So the next ones we're working on, as you know, we want to do one on the fall of Afghanistan to sort of put the big picture of it in perspective. We want to do one on the Canadian truckers, an important story during COVID about, another government overreach, in this case by the government of Canada. And we want to do a story on the Great Barrington Declaration, although now Jay Bhattacharya, one of our stars, is now nominated to be the head of the NIH. That adds an extra twist to the story. But those are 3 examples of more stories that you and I have talked about, Paul, with your team that really were misreported at the time or were forgotten or have lessons for today. And there are really a large number of such stories that are ignored by the mainstream media, just like they ignored Liz Truss's own story in the UK. It is easy to tell stories that this media has missed, and these are important things to do. So we are very enthusiastic about going forward with them.
Yeah, likewise, Michael. And I just want to stress, this isn't a polemic. None of these are polemics. These are considered treatments, and they do get all sides of the story. In the Crown Heights riots, we had Al Sharpton tell his side of the story. And that's important because you want to be able to show the listeners a balanced handling, and they can make up their own minds. So I want to thank you, Michael Pack, for being here. I want to thank Joe Sternberg, star of stage and documentary. And thank you all for listening. We're here every day on Potomac Watch, and we hope you'll be with us tomorrow. Thanks for listening.